In PSO2, there is a meta, a subclass meta, one that you're probably blindly following, one that we all have been following, one that is intuitive, but not fair. One that requires us to look deep at what each class offers for damage modifiers and added utility before considering whether to use it as a sub or not. So with that said, let's go over what each class offers as a sub, and after a little bit, I think you'll start to see a trend forming. So, first up is the tried and true Hunter, and what makes this so universally desired is the fact that it gives lots of unconditional melee and range damage through Fury Stance, additional perfect attack bonuses, Iron Will which can save you from an otherwise lethal hit, Automate which uses a mate item with no animation when your health drops below 50%, the active buff Hunter Physique which gives you up to a 25% damage reduction and stops you from being knocked back for its duration, and lastly the Flash Guards that give even more damage reduction. Also keep in mind that everything that was mentioned can be used in Fury Stance. You may need a few points into Guard Stance to take some of those things, but you do not have to use it. So all in all, Hunter offers so much and asks for nothing in return, as it has no conditionals on its damage, besides the perfect attacks, but you don't actually have to do that, but I would suggest it. Anyways, because of this, all classes, besides casters, can use a Hunter sub to great effect. Next up is the Fighter, and this one offers a lot of damage to its two stances, and gets access to even more damage and some PP cost reduction through its perfect attack bonuses, but at the cost of requiring you to be perfect attacking different PAs back to back to maintain them. Nonetheless, this gives across the board damage, so any class can make use of this one as a sub. But because it has no safety nets, as in no added survivability, it's not always recommended to use when you have the option to use a Hunter sub instead. There's then the Summoner, which gives completely unconditional and across the board damage multipliers through its all attack bonuses, up to plus 200 power to all powers, a passive 7.5% HP regen every 5 seconds when maxing HP Restorate, and Summoner's Mark which gives you a personal damage boost to a spot you mark. Though the mark can be a little finicky at times, it's still pretty nice to have. Lastly, a Summoner sub would give you access to techs, so if your class has poor mobility, you could now use Safoi Zero to get around, and instead of using as many mate items to heal, you could instead tap Megaverse or use Resta to heal instead, and so on. Now, the two Dex Mag classes can be somewhat controversial when talking about them as subclasses, but I think that's because many don't completely understand how they actually work. The first of which, being Braver, only really offers average additional damage through their stances. Basic Stance is very similar to Hunter's Fury Stance, as it gives unconditional damage. And then there's Precision Stance that gives a bit more than Basic Stance, but requires you to either be hitting a weak spot, or using the proper elemental technique that corresponds with your enemy's elemental weakness. Besides that, all Braver really offers is Quick Mate to use mates faster, which is actually pretty nice, but there's a ring that does the same thing. And then there's Perfect Recovery Heal, which for even 1 point will heal you for 10% of your HP when performing a perfect recovery. Lastly, you can use their Dex Mag skill as a subclass, so if you only have a Dex Mag, it would still convert melee and ranged power for you. All that being said though, a Hunter sub does just about the same thing and grants more protections, and a Fighter sub offers even more damage and some PP cost reduction too. The second controversial sub would be the Bouncer, as it does have a bunch of little quality of life benefits in its tree, like its fields, shift to air attack, deban PP Restorate, heal shearing, as well as being able to convert a Dex Mag into melee and tech power. After that though, its stances are generally very dependent on Bouncer specific weapons. Break Stance is very nice against breakable parts, but once they are broken, unless you are using Soaring Blades, it becomes useless. Then Elemental Stance can actually be paired pretty well with casters since they can use whatever element whenever. And Tekkers, as they can change their element on the fly with a ring, similar to how Jet Boots change their element on Bouncer. However, Elemental Stance's damage is rather low compared to what you could get out of a Fighter sub. And if you wanted a sub that can cast Techs, then you might as well go Summoner, as it offers similar multipliers as Elemental Stance, but has no conditions. Lastly, Bouncer also offers no protections as a sub either. Now, if you were wondering, yes, you can stack Braver and Bouncer's Dex Mag skills together, but in the grand scheme of things, that extra 200 power is not worth what you are losing out on when pairing these classes together. Moving on to the range classes, the Ranger itself grants a bit of range damage when up close and far away, as well as a bit of boosted damage on weak spots. On top of that, you still get access to their grenades and traps, which are good for PP regen and sometimes some CC. And lastly, you will still have access to Blight rounds as a sub too. However, you must still swap to a rifle when using this. At the end of the day, a Ranger sub boasts very big potential damage, but when it comes to practicality, It's not always worth the effort to simply maintain your blight rounds for that big damage. That being said, blight rounds can still be extremely valuable to a group in any setting. And then there's Gunner. And all this class offers as a sub is a little bit of range damage when over 75% HP, additional PP regen per hit with attack PP Restorate, and then some more range damage when you are close to enemies. But outside of Gunner itself, the point blank boosts really won't see much use. Now for the tech classes, and starting with the Tekker, it should first be noted that most of its sought after skills for its buffs are only usable as a main class, and its elemental mastery multipliers only really benefit a caster like the Force. After that though, it still does offer a few nice things you can use like PP Restorate, PP Conversion, and the option to take Tech Charge Perfect Attack Edition on a Tekker sub rather than needing to take it on a Force main class. All in all though, if you want to use a Tekker as a sub to anything besides the Force, you might want to consider using a Summoner sub instead, as they still get access to techs, and once reaching late game, there are plenty of other Tekker mains to handle the buffing, grouping, and Zanversing. For our last class, we have the Force, and just like the Tekker, all it offers as a sub are things that would benefit casters, such as its elemental mastery multipliers, Photon Flare, Advanced Tech Charge, and Charge PP Revival. That being said, the only class that could really make use of any of that would either be a hybrid caster Tekker build or a pure casting jet boot bouncer. But if you wanted to do either of those, you might want to just use a fighter or summoner sub instead for the reasons we mentioned previously. Of course, using a 4 sub 2 Tekker does open up the use of other elements, including the very powerful lightning techs. But if you're going to do that, then you might just want to go Force Tekker instead. As far as the Scion classes that can be used as subclasses go, they are extremely great subs, and I'll be going over them much more when they are released on PSO2 Global. But for now, I just wanted to go over what we currently have. I'd like to now end this by saying that I have personally played every class combination you could think of over the years, and I encourage everyone else to do so too, as that will help you truly understand why some combinations just aren't always worth the effort. Furthermore, this game is not difficult, and you could do just fine with just about any combination if you really want to. It's just that some things become the meta for a good reason, and I hope you now understand why. And with that, take care.